Every great story has a beginning. But what if the beginning of a nation's story was born not in marble halls or royal courts, but in silence, on a quiet farm along the banks of the Potomac River? This is where America's first breath was taken. The birthplace of George Washington, the man who would one day shape the destiny of millions. George Washington, a name carried across continents, a symbol of freedom, leadership, and resilience. But before the general, before the president, before the myth, there was a boy. A boy born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. And this very soil, this quiet stretch of land, became the unlikely cradle of a revolution. The George Washington Birthplace National Monument today spans more than 550 acres. It is not just preserved earth, it is memory given shape. A place where history refuses to fade, where visitors from every corner of the world, more than 100,000, each year come to trace the footsteps of the boy who would become the first president of the United States. The Washington family farm was simple, modest, and unremarkable by worldly standards, but its lessons were profound. Here, young George learned responsibility, endurance, and a respect for land that would stay with him for life. His father, Augustine, worked these fields. His mother, Mary, shaped the moral compass that would guide him through war and politics alike. Yet the original birthplace house no longer stands. It was lost, destroyed by fire long before Americans realized its value. For decades, the exact site was cloaked in mystery, its traces hidden beneath the earth. Only through archaeology and preservation did its story re-emerge, fragment by fragment, stone by stone. And so, the monument you see today is not just wood and brick. It is a reconstruction of memory, a testament to the will to remember. This place does more than preserve. It teaches. Living history programs bring the 18th century alive. Children see bread baking in clay ovens, flax spun into thread, livestock tended as they once were. For a moment, the past is not distant, it breathes. And in that breath, we remember that Washington was not born a legend, but a child of this land. From this modest birthplace to the battlefields of revolution, Washington's path reminds us of a larger truth. Greatness is not inherited, it is chosen. And those choices, forged here in obscurity, would one day command armies, unite a fractured people, and shape the first republic of the modern age. But the monument is not only about Washington. It is about us, our memory, our values, and our responsibility to preserve the past. In every preserved stone, in every reconstructed wall, lies a question. How do we honor the roots of our freedom? And how do we pass these stories forward so they are never forgotten? The George Washington Birthplace National Monument is more than a historic site. It is a seed planted centuries ago in quiet soil that grew into the tree of liberty. It reminds us that from the humblest beginnings, the greatest legacies are born. And it calls to each of us across time and across oceans to remember. Greatness begins not with power, but with character. And character, once planted, can shape the destiny of a nation. Welcome to the History Vault. Stay with us as we uncover hidden history. The story of a nation often begins in places where the world least expects it. Along the quiet banks of Virginia's Potomac River, surrounded by rolling fields and dense woodlands, stands a place that shaped the earliest breath of the United States. The George Washington Birthplace National Monument is not just a stretch of preserved land. It is the opening page in America's story. To stand here is to step back to the winter of 1732, when a boy named George Washington was born in a modest farmhouse, unaware that he would one day lead a revolution and become the first president of a new republic. The air here carries more than silence. It holds the weight of history. Every gust of wind that bends the grass seems to whisper of a beginning that changed the course of centuries. Unlike grand palaces or royal estates, the Washington family's homestead was simple, a working farm that stood in contrast to the power George would later wield. That contrast is what makes this monument extraordinary. It reminds us that greatness can rise not from luxury, but from the quiet strength of humble origins. The monument today spans more than 550 acres of preserved land, stretching across fields, woods, and riverbanks. Visitors arriving at its gates are met with a landscape that feels untouched by time. The Potomac glistens just as it did nearly 3 centuries ago, and the wide-open fields give a sense of both peace and possibility. This is not only geography, it is memory carved into the earth. For those who walk here, the sense of history is not something to imagine. It is something felt beneath their feet. The original house where Washington was born no longer exists. Destroyed long ago, it left behind only fragments of foundation stones, pieces of pottery, and silent traces hidden in the soil. For decades, its exact location remained a mystery. Yet this loss has given the site a powerful dual identity. It is both a reminder of fragility, how quickly history can vanish, and a testament to resilience, how memory can be restored through care, research, and imagination. The reconstructed memorial house, though not the original, stands today as a symbol. It is a way for visitors to picture the simplicity of the home where a child once grew, a child who would eventually shape the destiny of millions. When the U.S. government declared this land a national monument in 1930, it was more than a legal act. It was a statement of values. It declared that origins matter, that the birthplace of leadership deserves protection, and that remembering where a nation began is just as important as celebrating where it has gone. Since then, this place has drawn people from across the world. More than 100,000 visitors each year come not only to see a historic site, but to stand in the presence of a beginning. Walking through the grounds, one is struck by the details. The Colonial gardens bloom with the same plants grown in the 18th century, their scents carrying across the fields just as they did when Mary Washington tended them. Livestock, chosen to reflect the breeds of Washington's time, graze quietly in the pastures. Archaeologists have unearthed artifacts that tell stories of daily life, fragments of dishes, tools, and handmade nails that once formed the structure of a home. These are small pieces, yet they bring history alive in ways books cannot. They show that the story of George Washington is not only about battlefields and politics, but about family, labor, and survival. For the international audience who comes here, the monument offers more than an American story. It offers a universal truth, that leadership and greatness often spring from ordinary beginnings. George Washington was not born into royalty or wealth that guaranteed power. He was born into a family that worked the land, faced hardships, and made sacrifices. From this environment, he gained lessons that shaped his character: discipline, perseverance, and a respect for both responsibility and community. These qualities, learned here in quiet fields, would later guide him through the chaos of war and the uncertainty of building a new government. Standing on this land, visitors often reflect on what might have been. If not for this place, this family, and this soil, would Washington have grown into the man who carried the American Revolution on his shoulders? Would the history of the world look different without these fields? Without the influence of a modest Virginia farmhouse? The questions stir curiosity, making the site not just a piece of preserved history, but a mirror reflecting on the nature of destiny. As the sun sets over the Potomac, the monument reveals its true power. It is not simply about the past, it is about the continuity of memory. The shadows stretch across the same ground where Washington once played as a boy, reminding us that time moves forward, but roots remain. To protect this land is to protect the reminder that greatness is not born fully formed, but begins as a seed, often in places that appear small and unremarkable. The George Washington Birthplace National Monument is, above all, a testament to beginnings. It is proof that the origins of extraordinary lives are worth remembering. It invites us to step into the silence of history, to listen to the whispers of the Potomac, and to recognize that from these humble fields rose a man whose vision would shape not only America, but the future of democracy itself. In the early years of the 18th century, life on Virginia's northern neck was defined by the rhythm of the land. Here, surrounded by rivers and fields, George Washington was born into a world of both opportunity and struggle. His childhood home was not one of grandeur or wealth, but a working farm. To understand the man he would one day become, it is essential to understand the family and the environment that shaped his earliest years. The Washingtons were not aristocrats in the European sense. They were planters, part of Virginia's colonial gentry, managing land, crops, and labor in a system that tied them to both privilege and responsibility. George's father, Augustine Washington, had inherited land but also expanded it, working tirelessly to provide for his growing family. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was a woman of strength and conviction, whose influence on her son would echo throughout his life. Together, they raised a family in conditions that demanded resilience. The farmhouse itself was modest by comparison to the estates of later generations. Built of timber, it was practical and functional, designed for survival rather than show. Inside, rooms were simple, warmed by fireplaces furnished with essentials. The daily life of the Washington children revolved around the routines of the farm. From an early age, George would have observed his parents managing the land, planning the planting of crops and making decisions that could determine the family's well-being for years to come. Tobacco was the primary crop, the lifeblood of Virginia's economy at the time. Growing it required discipline, constant attention, and careful management. The soil, the weather, and the markets all dictated success or failure. From watching his father, George learned that life was uncertain and demanded foresight. Mistakes could mean hunger, debt, or ruin. These early lessons in risk and responsibility would become part of the foundation for the careful, measured approach he would later take as a military commander and president. But farming was not only about crops. Livestock needed tending, tools had to be repaired, and homes required upkeep. The Washington children were not sheltered from these realities. They grew up in an environment where work was constant, and survival depended on every hand contributing. Though George was the son of a planter, he was also a child of the land, shaped by the physical demands of rural life. Mary Ball Washington played a central role in his upbringing, particularly after Augustine's death when George was only 11 years old. Left to raise several children on her own, Mary became the guiding force in George's life. She was known for her strictness, her insistence on discipline, and her belief in moral duty. From her, George absorbed values of honesty, integrity, and perseverance, qualities that became cornerstones of his character. Though their relationship was sometimes difficult, her influence on him was lasting and profound. The household also reflected the complexities of colonial Virginia. The Washingtons, like many planters of their time, owned enslaved people who worked the fields and supported the family's livelihood. This reality exposed young George to the harsh contradictions of colonial society, a world striving for independence and liberty while built upon forced labor. It was an environment filled with both privilege and paradox, one that shaped his view of the world and his place within it. The geography of his childhood also played a significant role in his development. The wide Potomac River was not only a natural boundary, but also a window to a larger world. It carried ships, goods, and stories from across the Atlantic. For a boy growing up in rural Virginia, it represented both opportunity and curiosity. Washington's later fascination with surveying, exploration, and expansion can be traced to these early encounters with the vast landscapes and waterways around his home. Education, though not formal by modern standards, was another important part of his childhood. George did not attend college, but he learned through tutors, family guidance, and, most importantly, through experience. He studied mathematics, particularly geometry, which later supported his career as a surveyor. He read books on agriculture, manners, and leadership, absorbing lessons that would shape his thinking. This blend of practical knowledge and self-education created a man who valued learning, not as a status symbol but as a tool for survival and leadership. What makes this chapter of Washington's life remarkable is not the presence of privilege, but the balance of simplicity, hardship, and opportunity. His beginnings were ordinary by the standards of the colonial gentry, but they carried within them the seeds of greatness. He witnessed the importance of land, the strength of discipline, the burden of responsibility, and the contradictions of a society still forming its identity. To imagine George Washington as a boy is to picture him running across open fields, listening to the crackle of the fireplace in the family home, watching ships sail down the Potomac, and hearing his mother's firm voice shaping his sense of right and wrong. These are not the images of a myth, but of a real child growing in a real environment. And it was this environment, far more than any single event, that prepared him for the extraordinary path ahead. The Washington family farm was not a stage of glory, but a crucible of character. From it emerged a young man shaped by work, guided by values, and tempered by loss. This beginning tells us something essential about George Washington, that the qualities which later defined him were not bestowed by fate, but built day by day in the soil of Virginia. It is here, in the quiet routines of farm life, that the foundation of leadership was laid. In the heart of Virginia's countryside, where rolling fields meet dense woodlands, the birthplace of George Washington carries more than the memory of a single man. It tells the story of a family whose legacy became inseparable from the birth of a nation. The Washington lineage, stretching back across generations, was not one of kings or noble titles, but of planters, merchants, and men and women who wrestled with the land and the challenges of colonial life. Their roots in Virginia soil shaped the environment into which the future first president was born, and in turn, that soil nurtured the values that would one day guide him as the leader of a new republic. The Washington family had settled in Virginia in the mid-1600s. They were part of the wave of English, immigrants seeking opportunity in the New World, drawn by the promise of land and prosperity. Like many families, they began modestly, carving out farms from dense forests and relying on determination and resilience to survive. Over time, through land acquisitions, marriages, and careful management, the Washingtons rose into the ranks of Virginia's planter class. Yet their status was far from secure. The fortunes of colonial families often rose and fell with the success of crops, the unpredictability of markets, and the fragile ties of inheritance. By the time of George's birth in 1732, the Washingtons had established themselves as a family of some prominence, though not extravagance. His father, Augustine Washington, was a man of ambition. He inherited lands from his own father and expanded them further, investing in farms, ironworks, and enterprises that reflected both the risks and opportunities of colonial America. These ventures demanded foresight and resilience, qualities that would mark his children as well. The family's position placed them within the Virginia gentry, but they lived closer to the land than the elites of Europe. Tied to its rhythms and reliant on its bounty, George's mother, Mary Ball Washington, added another layer to this story. Coming from a family of integrity and strength, she embodied the moral fiber and discipline that became so deeply ingrained in her son's character. When Augustine died unexpectedly, Mary took on the role of guiding her children through uncertainty. This experience taught George the significance of perseverance and duty, values that were deeply tied to both his family identity and the colonial world they inhabited. Yet the Washington family story cannot be told without acknowledging the institution that underpinned their livelihood: slavery. Like many planters of their time, the Washingtons depended on the labor of enslaved people to cultivate tobacco and sustain their farms. This stark reality is part of the Washington legacy, a contradiction that shaped the household in which George grew up. As a child, he would have seen firsthand the reliance on enslaved labor, an experience that tied him to the prosperity and moral complexities of colonial Virginia. It was within this paradoxical environment of privilege and oppression that his sense of identity took form. Beyond their immediate household, the Washingtons were connected to a larger network of families and relationships that extended across Virginia. These alliances were built through marriages, business partnerships, and land deals, weaving the Washingtons into the fabric of colonial society. This interconnected world taught George the importance of reputation, honor, and trust. In a society where land and family name carried weight, maintaining respect and credibility was essential. These lessons would later shape the careful manner in which Washington carried himself as both a military leader and statesman. Life for the Washington family was demanding but also forward-looking. The farm required constant attention. Fields needed plowing, tobacco demanded care, and livestock required tending. These daily routines were shared responsibilities, and George grew up in a household where everyone contributed in some way. He absorbed the discipline of work, the necessity of planning ahead, and the understanding that success was never guaranteed. Even as the son of a planter, he learned that survival depended on both strategy and resilience. But there was also a broader horizon that shaped his family's perspective. The Potomac River, flowing near their lands, was more than a geographical landmark. It was a gateway to trade, a connection to markets in England, and a symbol of opportunity. Watching ships come and go, carrying goods across the Atlantic, George would have realized that his family's story was part of something larger, the interconnected world of the British Empire. This awareness of being tied to forces far beyond Virginia instilled in him a sense of both possibility and caution. Education within the Washington family reflected their station. While George never attended college, the emphasis was on practical learning: mathematics, surveying, agricultural practices, and moral instruction. These were the subjects that prepared a young man not only to manage land, but to lead others. Books, though scarce, were treasured, and self-education became a hallmark of George's upbringing. It was an environment that fostered curiosity, independence, and the ability to adapt, qualities essential to the challenges he would face in adulthood. The Washington family story, then, is not one of untouchable privilege, but of steady growth. Rooted in the land and marked by perseverance, they lived within the realities of their time, navigating both opportunities and contradictions. It was this heritage, a blend of ambition, discipline, and resilience, that George inherited. The family's rise was not extraordinary by colonial standards, but it carried within it the lessons that would prepare him for extraordinary leadership. To understand the significance of George Washington's birthplace, one must look beyond the myth and see the family that shaped him. They were not symbols carved in stone, but real people bound to the earth, striving for survival and wrestling with the moral and economic complexities of their era. From their struggles and successes, George inherited a framework for his own life, an appreciation for land, a respect for discipline, and an awareness of the weight of responsibility. In the Washington family story lies the foundation of a man who would one day lead a revolution and guide a nation. Their legacy was not measured only in acres of land or harvests of tobacco, but in the values and character passed from parent to child. And it was this legacy, born in the fields and hearths of Virginia, that became inseparable from the very beginnings of the United States. From the quiet banks of the Potomac River to the turbulent fields of battle, the journey of George Washington reflects the remarkable transformation of a boy raised on a Virginia farm into the commander who would lead a revolution. His path from boyhood to the battlefield was neither easy nor assured. Yet every step, every trial, every decision built upon the lessons he carried from his early life. It is in this journey that we see how a child shaped by family, land, and discipline became the man the world would one day call the father of his country. Growing up without the privilege of a college education or the inherited wealth of Virginia's grandest families, Washington's beginnings were modest compared to many of his peers. Yet his childhood gave him something far more enduring, a sense of resilience, resourcefulness, and responsibility. After his father's death, George understood at a young age the weight of duty, not only to his mother and siblings, but to the land they lived on. He worked the soil, oversaw livestock, and helped manage family affairs. These experiences instilled in him the ability to lead, not by command alone, but by example. By his teenage years, Washington was already showing signs of ambition and capability. His fascination with the natural world and practical learning led him toward surveying, a skill that was both respected and lucrative in colonial Virginia. At just 16, he joined surveying expeditions that carried him deep into the frontier. Imagine a young Washington navigating forests, rivers, and mountains, mapping out lands that were as wild and untamed as the colonial dream itself. These expeditions toughened him physically and mentally, sharpening his eye for detail and his appreciation for order and precision. More importantly, they connected him to the vastness of America, giving him a perspective that few others of his age possessed. This training in surveying was more than a profession. It was preparation for command. In the wilderness, Washington learned how to endure hardship, adapt quickly, and make decisions that could mean success or failure for an entire group. These were lessons he carried into military life when he entered service with the Virginia militia. The colonies were not at peace. Tensions simmered as European powers vied for control of North America. For Washington, the call to military duty was both a personal opportunity and a test of his character. In his early 20s, Washington stepped into history during the French and Indian War. This conflict, part of a much larger struggle between Britain and France, thrust him into leadership at an age when most men were still finding their way. He was sent into the rugged Ohio Valley, a region where control of trade and territory was fiercely contested. Here, Washington faced his first taste of battle. At Fort Necessity in 1754, he commanded men under fire, making decisions that carried consequences far beyond himself. Though the battle ended in defeat, it provided him with invaluable lessons. He learned about the unpredictability of war, the importance of preparation, and the burden of responsibility when lives depended on his judgment. The French and Indian War exposed Washington to the realities of both victory and failure. He saw firsthand the discipline of professional European armies and the challenges of leading colonial militias, which were often poorly supplied and loosely organized. These early experiences hardened him, teaching him the balance between courage and caution. They also left him with a reputation that extended beyond Virginia, marking him as a leader of potential. But Washington's journey was not defined by military action alone. In the years that followed, he returned to civilian life at Mount Vernon, where he took on the role of planter, businessman, and husband. Yet the lessons of the battlefield never left him. They shaped the way he managed his estate, dealt with neighbors, and participated in Virginia's political life. He understood that leadership required more than words. It demanded vision, persistence, and the ability to unite others toward a common goal. When the colonies moved closer to revolution against Britain, Washington's earlier experiences placed him in a unique position. He was not the wealthiest man in Virginia, nor the most educated. But he was respected for his integrity, his service, and his ability to inspire confidence. The skills he had developed in his youth, discipline from the farm, resilience from the frontier, courage from the battlefield, merged into qualities that the Continental Congress could not ignore. When they sought a commander to lead the colonial forces against one of the most powerful armies in the world, they turned to George Washington. Looking back, it is clear that the boy who once surveyed wilderness trails was preparing, without knowing it, for the vast challenges of guiding a fledgling nation. His ability to endure hardship, to learn from mistakes, and to rise stronger after setbacks defined his path. From the quiet fields of his childhood to the smoke-filled skies of war, his journey was a reminder that greatness is rarely born in moments of ease. It is forged in trial, shaped by failure, and proven in resilience. George Washington's progression from boyhood to battlefield was not just the story of one man, it was the story of America itself, a land of opportunity, struggle, and constant reinvention. Just as Washington grew from uncertain beginnings into a leader of resolve, so too would the colonies transform into a nation determined to stand on its own. His story mirrored the spirit of his country. Humble origins, tested by fire, and destined for greatness. Today, the George Washington Birthplace National Monument is more than a preserved site. It is a living classroom where history is brought to life in ways that connect the past to the present. Nestled along the serene Potomac River, this monument not only commemorates the birthplace of America's first president, but also serves as a bridge that carries visitors back in time to understand the world that shaped him. To walk through this landscape is to step into the rhythm of colonial Virginia, where fields, farmhouses, and memories tell stories far beyond what books alone can capture. The monument covers more than 550 acres, embracing rolling farmland, woodlands, and stretches of riverfront. This expanse allows visitors to imagine the environment as it might have appeared nearly 3 centuries ago. But this is not just a quiet memorial. It is a carefully designed place where history is lived and experienced. The reconstructed memorial house, designed in the 1930s to represent the type of home in which Washington could have been born, sits as the symbolic centerpiece. While it is not the original dwelling, it stands as a tribute to his beginnings and represents the modest yet dignified world of Virginia's gentry class. For many who come here, stepping inside this house is a chance to picture a young child taking his first steps in a room where wooden beams and flickering firelight shaped everyday life. Surrounding the house are the working farms and gardens, tended much as they were in Washington's time. Visitors see sheep grazing in pastures, oxen pulling plows, and gardens planted with the same crops that sustained colonial families: corn, wheat, and tobacco. These scenes are not staged for spectacle. They are carefully crafted demonstrations of daily labor in the 18th century. By witnessing these routines, modern audiences begin to understand how much effort survival demanded and how deeply people's lives were tied to the cycles of the land. It is a reminder that even a man destined to lead a nation began in a world defined by soil, sweat, and discipline. The monument also places emphasis on the people whose lives intersected here, many of whom history once left in silence. The Washington family story is told in detail, but equal space is given to the enslaved men and women who worked the land. Exhibits and programs bring forward the voices of those who cultivated the fields, maintained the homestead, and lived in bondage under the same sky that promised liberty to others. By acknowledging their presence, the site confronts the contradictions of America's beginnings, the coexistence of freedom and slavery, and encourages reflection on how this complexity shaped Washington's own life and the country he would later lead. Education lies at the heart of the monument's mission. School groups walk through these grounds not just to look, but to experience. Children learn how wool was spun into thread, how meals were prepared over open hearths, and how the river served as a vital highway for trade. These immersive experiences make history tangible, connecting young minds to a past that can sometimes feel distant. The monument staff, dressed in period clothing, interpret the lives of farmers, artisans, and laborers, creating encounters that linger in memory long after the visit ends. Beyond the farm and house, the landscape itself is preserved as a vital part of the monument's story. Trails wind through forests and fields, inviting visitors to pause and reflect. The Potomac River glistens in the sunlight much as it did in Washington's youth, reminding us that geography itself was a force in shaping destiny. This river connected the Washingtons to markets, neighbors, and the greater world, while also anchoring their daily life. Standing along its banks, one can almost hear the echoes of wagons creaking, boats docking, and families building their futures. The memorial also includes a burial ground, where members of the Washington family rest. These weathered stones offer a direct, almost intimate connection to the lineage that gave rise to the nation's first president. It is a quiet space, shaded and solemn, where history feels personal and immediate. Visitors often leave here with a renewed sense of reverence, not only for George Washington himself, but for the generations whose lives made his possible. But the monument is not frozen in the past. It continues to evolve, adapting its interpretation to meet the questions and expectations of each new generation. In recent years, the focus has broadened to tell a fuller story, one that includes not just Washington's family, but the communities, enslaved and free, who shared this land. This approach ensures that the monument remains relevant, reminding us that history is not just about remembering what was, but about understanding how it shapes what is. Events held at the monument breathed life into this mission. Seasonal festivals, reenactments, and commemorations draw people from across the country and beyond. These gatherings are more than entertainment. They are communal acts of remembrance, opportunities to connect with the struggles and triumphs of early America. Whether it is a candlelit evening program, a reenacted harvest, or a patriotic ceremony, each moment ties the past to the present in a way that resonates deeply with visitors. In many ways, the George Washington Birthplace National Monument stands as a reminder that history does not exist in books alone. It lives in the land, in the traditions passed down, and in the way we choose to preserve and interpret the stories of those who came before us. This site invites people from around the world to witness the humble beginnings of a leader who would one day command armies and guide a nation. It challenges us to reflect on the contradictions of America's past, while also inspiring us with the endurance, vision, and values that emerged from this very soil. By walking these grounds, hearing the voices of interpreters, and standing where Washington's story began, visitors become part of a journey much larger than themselves. The monument is not only about honoring one man's birthplace, it is about understanding how the roots of leadership and the seeds of a nation were planted in a landscape that still speaks, if only we take the time to listen. Greatness rarely announces itself at birth. It begins quietly, often in places overlooked by history's grand stages. Along the banks of the Potomac River, in the rolling fields of Colonial, Virginia, stood a modest farmhouse where a child named George Washington entered the world in 1732. There was no fanfare, no prophecy carved into stone, only the ordinary rhythm of farm life and the daily labors of a family bound to the land. Yet from this soil, both rich and demanding, grew the character of a man who would one day shape the destiny of a nation. What makes Washington's birthplace significant is not only that it was his first home, but that it represented the environment in which the seeds of his character were sown. The fields taught lessons of patience and persistence. The river offered a sense of connection to the wider world. The family household, shaped by both privilege and hardship, instilled responsibility and resilience. These early influences formed the foundation of the man who would become a symbol of unity and strength during America's most fragile years. The story of Washington reminds us that greatness is not always born of privilege or perfection. His early years were marked by uncertainty. His father's death left his family with fewer resources, and Washington himself lacked the formal education that many of his peers enjoyed. Yet it was in these very limitations that he discovered resourcefulness. He learned to rely on discipline, on observation, and on a relentless will to improve himself. From surveying the Virginia wilderness to leading men in battle, he turned each challenge into preparation for something larger. The power of his legacy lies in its universality. Washington's life demonstrates that extraordinary achievements can grow out of humble beginnings. His birthplace, preserved today as a national monument, stands as a reminder that no matter how small the start, potential can expand beyond imagination when guided by character and purpose. Visitors walking through the quiet fields where his story began often reflect on their own lives, recognizing that greatness is not defined by circumstance alone, but by choices made in response to those circumstances. Yet Washington's story is not free from complexity. The very land that nurtured him was sustained by enslaved labor, a contradiction that marked the world he was born into. This tension between ideals of liberty and the reality of bondage shaped both his time and his legacy. By standing at his birthplace, one confronts not only the triumphs of his life, but also the paradoxes of early America. To honor his story fully is to acknowledge both the inspiration and the flaws. Understanding that history is neither simple nor one-sided, the preservation of this birthplace is, in itself, a profound statement. Generations of Americans have worked to maintain these grounds, not simply to honor a hero, but to preserve the reminder that leadership begins in the quiet corners of life. The house reconstructed here is symbolic. Yet the fields, the river, and the graves of family members are real, anchoring Washington's story in the physical world. By protecting these spaces, the monument ensures that history remains tangible and accessible, offering each visitor the chance to encounter the roots of America's journey. As we reflect on Washington's beginnings, it becomes clear that his greatest gift was not military genius or political strategy alone, but the steadiness of character that he carried into every role. He embodied perseverance when armies faltered, humility when power was offered, and vision when the future seemed uncertain. These traits were not conjured suddenly when revolution arrived. They were cultivated over years, beginning in the soil of his birthplace. For an international audience, Washington's story holds meaning beyond the borders of the United States. It speaks to the timeless truth that leadership is forged in ordinary moments. Nations across the world have figures who rise from modest origins to guide their people through moments of crisis. Washington belongs to that lineage of leaders whose legacy endures not because of wealth or privilege, but because of integrity, resilience, and sacrifice. His birthplace stands as a universal symbol of how greatness can emerge from unexpected places. The monument challenges us to reflect on our own journeys. Standing before the fields and waters that once surrounded a young boy with few resources but boundless determination, one cannot help but ask, what seeds of greatness lie within us? What choices will define our own legacies? Washington's life reminds us that leadership is not a gift reserved for the few, but a responsibility that emerges from values lived daily, from perseverance in the face of obstacles, and from a willingness to put others before oneself. As the sun sets over the Potomac, casting golden light across the land where George Washington first opened his eyes, the meaning of this place comes into focus. It is more than a memorial. It is a reminder that history begins in small and ordinary places, that greatness is nurtured in silence long before it is recognized by the world. From this soil grew a man who carried the hopes of a people and the birth of a nation. And from his story, we are reminded that every beginning, no matter how humble, carries within it the potential to change the course of history. Thank you for watching History Vault.